Hi, Scott Mitchell from the Silver River Museum here, and today we're talking about the settlement of Florida and Seminole Indians. Now, before we talk about Seminoles, let's just do a quick review. Prior to any Europeans coming to Florida, there were Native American tribes like the Timucua, the Apalachee, and the Calusa that had lived here for thousands of years. The Spanish explorers arrived in 1513, and everything began to change quickly. There were several European countries that fought for control over the territory in the New World, which is what they called the Americas, North America, South America, and Central America. In Florida, the Spanish controlled it most of the time, but it's also important to remember that the British controlled Florida for a while, and the French even had small portions of it under their control at certain times. The other important thing to remember, and this does factor into Seminole history, is that to the north of Florida originally was British territory, but then in 1783 it became the United States. They had slavery, and a lot of slaves would escape and make it to Florida to join the Spanish and have their freedom. Now this is an important part of the Seminole story, and we'll talk about it more in a few minutes. So I'll be throwing a lot of dates around, and it will be a good idea for you to jot them down and take notes. In fact, I have notes in front of me because it's so much information it starts to swirl around in your head. But if you write down important dates, who, what, where, when, those types of notes, then you can put that information into a timeline later and make more sense of it. As we talk about Seminole Indians, think about how you'd have felt to have lived during this time and to have been a Seminole Indian, or perhaps a U.S. settler or soldier. In the early 1700s, many of the original Florida Native Americans had died from diseases and warfare. And there were other Native Americans to the north, the Creek people who lived in Alabama and Georgia, who had gone through a series of civil wars and were also fighting with white settlers that had moved into their territory. And they began moving into Florida because there was plenty of land and there weren't too many people living here. As the Creek moved into Florida, they certainly would have encountered some of those remaining Native American tribes that were here first, like the Timucua and the Apalachee. The other people they would have met would have been escaped African American slaves coming from British territory to the north. Now this is an important fact because Seminole culture was really made up of Creek Indians, leftover Florida Indians like the Timucua, and escaped slaves. And they began to form villages and start families and make new communities. And those groups gave rise to Seminole culture. In 1783, two important things happened that affected Florida. Spain had given Florida to England for 20 years, from 1763 to 1783. And in 1783, England gave Florida back to Spain. The same year, to the north, the United States gained their independence from England. So 1783 was a big year. Florida came back under Spanish control, and the United States were formed. Now this set the stage for conflict between the United States and Spanish-controlled Florida because of all those slaves that were escaping across the border into Spanish Florida. The wealthy plantation owners in the young United States to the north who owned slaves did not like the fact that they were escaping and going into Florida and they could not get them back. And in the early 1800s, a young General Andrew Jackson began to venture into Spanish-held Florida to attack Seminole towns and burn them and try to recapture slaves and bring them back into the United States. As early as 1816, Jackson's troops were on the Apalachicola River up in the panhandle of Florida, and they attacked a fort that was home to hundreds of free African Americans who were fighting for their freedom. A cannon shot from one of the gunboats landed in the storehouse full of gunpowder, and the whole fort exploded, killing just about everyone inside. A few years later, in 1818, Jackson's same troops attacked another Seminole town called Bowlegs Town near the Swanee River. They fought for several days and eventually burned the entire town. The Seminoles retreated into the swamps and moved further south to safety. But this set the stage for a treaty negotiation between the United States and Spain, where Spain actually threw up their hands and gave Florida to the United States for good. In 1819, the Adams-Onis Treaty resulted in Florida being turned over to the United States, and in 1820, Florida became a U.S. territory. This period of fighting and warfare in the early 1800s between U.S. soldiers and the Seminole in Florida is known as the First Seminal War. And the First Seminal War lasted from 1816 to 1818. It was mainly waged to recapture escaped slaves and try to control the wild boundary between the United States and Spanish Florida. After Florida became a U.S. territory, more and more settlers began to move into Florida. This inevitably created tension with the Seminole Indians and free black Seminoles who had lived in Florida for many, many years. By this time, General Andrew Jackson was now President Andrew Jackson, and he passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which meant that all of the Indians in the Southeast had to move out west to Oklahoma. The United States wanted that land, and they wanted the Native Americans to leave. How would you feel if the government told you to move to a whole new state and they wanted your land and you didn't have a choice in the matter? How would you react? Would you go? Would you run away and hide? Would you stay and fight? What do you think you would do? Those were the choices the Seminoles faced. And in 1835, after years of arguing and negotiating back and forth with the government, they decided to fight. On a cold December day in 1835, Osceola, who was a war leader of the Seminole, attacked Fort King right here in Marion County. Fort King was an Army fort. The Army had built forts all across the state to give the soldiers a base of operations and to allow a safe refuge for settlers to go to during time of warfare. Osceola and his warriors attacked Fort King and killed several people, including the government agent, Wiley Thompson, that had been sent to Florida from Washington, D.C. to help convince the Indians to move to Oklahoma. On the same day, other warriors just south of Marion County attacked a group of soldiers marching up to Ocala from Tampa and killed almost all of them. It was the start of the Second Seminole War, and the Second Seminole War would last from 1835 to 1842. It was one of the bloodiest campaigns the United States had fought up until that time. Tens of thousands of soldiers were sent to Florida to fight Seminole warriors. And in fact, the Seminole were outnumbered 10 to 1. There were about 30,000 soldiers that fought in the Second Seminole War, and we estimate only maybe 3,000 Seminole people. Now, this included free black Seminoles, and they referred to themselves as black Seminoles. Even today, their descendants call themselves that. And you could become a black Seminole by either being an escaped slave and joining the Seminole, or being from a mixed family where one parent might be a Seminole and another parent might be an escaped slave. The black Seminoles were fierce warriors. They knew that if they were captured, they would be sent back into slavery, and they would fight till the end. In fact, the black Seminole warriors are one of the reasons that the Army could never conquer the Seminole people. Many of them agreed to move to Oklahoma, but they never signed an official treaty of surrender with the U.S. government. A famous black Seminole warrior named Abraham was one of Osceola's key advisors. Abraham built a town just south of Marion County and Lake County called Abraham's Old Town, which was attacked and burned by the U.S. Army in 1836. The U.S. Army became so desperate to beat the Seminoles during the Second Seminole War that they even resorted to dirty tricks. During times of war, there is a tradition called the flag of truce, which is a white flag that you wave, and it signals to your enemy that you want to come and have some talks, but that you'll be guaranteed safe passage and you'll be able to leave after those talks. It's a courtesy and tradition that armies have observed for hundreds of years. When Osceola was lured to come and talk with the U.S. Army under a flag of truce, they tricked him and ended up taking him prisoner. They shipped Osceola up to a fort in South Carolina where he eventually died. After the loss of Osceola, many of the Seminoles agreed to move to Oklahoma. By 1842, the Army had decided that they had removed enough Seminole people from Florida, that the war was over. However, they had not removed all of them, and there were several hundred that had retreated deep into the Everglades. Years later, in 1845, when Florida becomes an official state, what do you think happens? If more and more people move to Florida and they encounter the leftover Seminoles that had not agreed to move to Oklahoma, do you think there would be trouble? If you guessed yes, you're correct. And by 1855, there was a third Seminole War. The Third Seminole War occurred mostly in South Florida, and it was also called Billy Bowleg's War. He was one of the main leaders of the Third Seminole War. The war lasted until 1858, when the government brought some of the Seminole people that had moved to Oklahoma back to Florida to convince Chief Billy Bowlegs that he too should join them. He respected these leaders, and he finally agreed and took most of his followers to Oklahoma. However, not all of the Seminole people agreed. Another Seminole leader named Sam Jones and his followers decided to stay. They refused to leave, and they retreated farther and farther back into the Everglades. It is estimated that only 200 to 300 Seminole people remained in Florida at the end of the Third Seminole War in 1858. The remaining Seminoles stayed hidden deep in the Everglades, and their descendants still live there today. We'll be talking about modern Seminoles in Florida in part 2 of this video. I hope some of these dates and historical facts help you to better understand how Florida became a territory and then a state of the United States, and also how the Seminole people came to be. I'll look forward to seeing you for part 2 when we'll talk about modern Seminoles in Florida.